I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is just Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Tanner. I'll be one of your hosts today, joined, as usual, by Taylor. First, we do have two new patrons to thank, so a big thank you to Joshua and Charlotte for supporting us on Patreon. Hope you enjoy what you find over there. We've got, as always, some new cool Patreon stuff in the works, and we have a pretty decent back catalog of those episodes to check out. For anyone interested, you can head over to patreon.com/beyondthebreakers. There are two tiers. There's a $3 tier and a $5 tier. We alternate with our new recording schedule. We do main episode, bonus, main episode, bonus each cycle. $5 gets you both of those bonus episodes. $3 gets you one. They both get you access to our Discord, which we are focusing on using more in Season 5. Head on over there if you've got episode discussion stuff. Lately, I've been trying to drop in some sort of behind-the-scenes stuff, or maybe little factoids that didn't quite make it into an episode. Gotten some great episode suggestions on there. And then, of course, there's a bunch of random stuff. You can, show off your pets. We love seeing pets. Talk about music, movies, whatever it is. But definitely head over to Patreon. What else? Been a couple weeks since we recorded. So, Taylor, what have you been up to?
Oh, not a lot. One thing I did want to add, I have been trying to be more active on Blue Sky. So do give us a follow there as we begin the long, slow transition from Twitter. Twitter has become actively less fun in the last couple weeks. So I've definitely started using Blue Sky more.
That makes sense. I'm still mainly using Twitter, but I am on Blue Sky, but until someone turns Twitter off, I'll probably not stop using it. Someone's gonna. That's kind of how I feel.
Like I'm there till it sinks. There's just too much information there and stuff. But like Blue Sky is getting better, so do give us a follow there.
We're also on Instagram.
Yeah, that too. Outside of that stuff, I finished the Righteous Gemstones. I'm caught up, I should say. There's still the new season coming out in March, I think. It was great. I loved it.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. Wonderful series. I like that they are. I like that, it's sad to see it go after this season, but it is cool, I think, to put a cap on things like that.
It's very much how I feel about What We Do in the Shadows. They just had their final season, and it was nice to be left wanting more. That's how a show should end. Wanting more in a good way, not slugging through the last season of The Office. Also, because I don't have enough Danny McBride in my life, I decided to start Eastbound and Down.
Oh, nice. I know, we watched the first, season-ish of it, I think, when it came out first.
It's funny, we're in the first season right now, and it's funny watching episodes where there's scenes that I totally, forgot about, but they pop right back in my head. Mm-hmm. There's some good stuff in there. It's definitely of its time. It's interesting how Danny McBride humor has changed from, 2008 or 9 or 10 to modern day. But it's really fun. It's a good series. He plays, that same funny character he always plays. Mm-hmm. On the reading front, I finished Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham.
How did that go?
It was great, Well,
not for them.
Yeah, no, not so much for the Soviets. It was bad. But if you enjoyed the Chernobyl miniseries, you'll definitely like this. Did you see the miniseries?
I did, yes.
Yeah, it's good. That's good stuff.
For anyone who hasn't seen it, but does know the terror, Jared Harris is the main character in the Chernobyl series. So that's maybe a big attraction.
And then I started a new book. I started To Purge the Land with Blood by Stephen B. Oates. It's about the life and times of one John Brown.
Very cool.
Definitely one of those figures that I know kind of how the story ends, but I don't know a ton about the guy. And I know he kind of gets associated with Kansas, but it's been very interesting that he actually lives most of his life in New York and Ohio. So it's just very interesting. It's interesting hearing about the border wars with... So
would you say that John Brown loved the Mets?
It's interesting hearing, just learning more about his life and what he was exactly, which is he's just one of those really unique, weird characters. It's kind of hard to put him in one box. He's a religious fanatic, but he also is very progressive in his views about race. And like, he's not one of those people that's like, oh, well, of course they shouldn't be slaves. Very much like, no, of course they're people just like me. So it's very interesting here. And he's very militant about it.
I have this bloody brain dripping hatchet in my hand to prove it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the man would probably be called like a domestic terrorist today.
I saw someone trying to cancel him on Twitter the other day of like, if John Brown was alive today, he would be like bombing abortion clinics and stuff. But he didn't. That's not what he did. We have no way of knowing that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, you can extrapolate some of his religious views, I guess, and paste them onto modern things. But he very much was mainly concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, it's
race.
quite possible. Yes, he could have, but it's like, okay, that's your fan fiction. I'm going to write a different fan fiction about John Brown where he doesn't.
I mean, he definitely sounds like a very difficult man to be around, and like definitely not a lot of nuance in a lot of his views, but some of his views are correct. Mm-hmm. So definitely, he was a huge fan of Jonathan Edwards, the Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God guy. So, that's kind of where he's coming out of.
A John Brown type character is interesting in that kind of shows people say it's like, oh, I believe this or I believe that. And it's like, do you really? Because I think if you really believe that,
right.
This is what you'd be doing.
This man would not be sitting on Twitter posting today.
we can't all be John Brown.
No.
Actually, that would be no way to run a country.
If everyone was their own John Brown. It is a good book, though. It's a little old. It's published in the 70s, which means they're really free with the N-word and all their quotes. But other than that, it's it's pretty good. It's a good neutral resource. Like, it's very upfront that it is an attempt to be objective and show his good sides and bad sides.
Speaking of histories being objective or not objective, I'm reading a book right now. Oh, Paluche is here. That reminds me. Yes, anyone who follows me on social media has probably seen we have a new crew member. We have a little baby kitten now. Of course, we lost Josie a few weeks ago, which is sad, but there is also always cats that need homes, and we have our two older boys who need some younger energy in the house. So we headed up to Green Bay, and we picked up a little baby. But anyway, that's not really media, I guess. Although cats will help me create media.
Yeah, and it's fun. Did you want to say his name?
His name is Wilkie.
Midshipman Wilkie.
Named for Wilkie Collins, because I named basically our last two cats that we acquired, Matilda a while ago and Josephine, and so Katie went with Wilkie because Wilkie Collins is one of her favorite classic authors.
I like that name. It's a fun name.
I'm already spinning up nicknames for him. I'm going to call him Wilk Chamberlain is one thing I know I'm going to call him. So I'm gonna start him out with that and see what that evolves into. It
really is fun giving them nicknames. My personal favorite I have for Sven is Svendrick Lamar.
Songs also, the songs will develop around them. They're building their lore, and that has to start early. But you were talking about that John Brown being an objective history, and I have one that is definitely not. I'm reading a book called The Scottish War of Independence. This is a direct consequence of me reading that Mark Morris biography of Edward I. And so the Scottish War of Independence is by Evan MacLeod Barron. And in the introduction, he basically says, like, this is not an objective history. This is not a safe space. This is my history of Scotland that I am writing here as a proud Highland Scot. He says in the introduction, it is perhaps impossible for any writer, be he Scottish or English, to approach the study of the Scottish War of Independence without some bias, conscious or unconscious, in favor of his own country. In the following pages, I've done my best to be impartial, but nonetheless, I frankly confess that I write as a Scotsman and as a Highlander, and at that, accordingly, my sympathies are naturally and rightly Scottish and Highland. I use the latter phrase advisedly, for the Highlands have for so long been treated with such ignorance, neglect, and I regret to say contempt by Scottish historians, that I found it necessary to emphasize, in a manner which some people may resent, the part played by the Highlands and the rest of Celtic Scotland in the War of Independence. I would simply ask readers to remember that I am up against the accepted theories and beliefs of centuries, and that the true blame for any seemingly undue emphasis on things Highland and things Celtic in these pages lies, at the door of those modern historians who have used the reputation which is theirs to perpetuate a view of Scottish history which is altogether fallacious and misleading. That was all one sentence.
I felt like you were about to do like a Hamilton rap.
I like reading a history occasionally where it comes out and says, yo, this is not objective. This is not.
I think
take your sensitive ass back to Wikipedia.
I think that it can be good to read a source when you know its biases. It helps you understand the source and understand why, like, the parts that maybe you want to dig into a little deeper on your own.
Also, an important detail here. This book was published in May of 1914.
Okay.
Which I always think is funny, like, when I see things published around, like when something else major is happening in the world, your book comes out in May 1914 and you're just like waiting to see how it does, hoping that nothing comes up to distract people from it, like a world war. I hope people still find time to read my book.
It's kind of like looking to see like what movies released the week of 9/11 or something.
Yeah. And so it is an interesting like perspective of historiography because he, as he points out, like up to that point, now when you read a book about like Scottish history or English history at the time, Robert the Bruce is portrayed by and large heroically, like kind of the general history of it. They just made that movie, The Outlaw King, about him. And he kind of has this, image of like, oh, he's the guy who won independence for Scotland from England. As he points out early in this book, is that like up until the time he's writing this, Robert the Bruce is sort of seen as really just like an opportunist, seen very derisively as, a collaborationist with the English up until it's time for him to switch sides and suddenly take advantage of it. Mm-hmm. So it is actually interesting reading a biased history in a way that he's a very good writer. So like the facts are objective, but they are presented with an acknowledged favor towards one side.
It's like how I can listen to Shelby Foote talk about the Civil War, but I'm very aware of what his biases are.
The war of Yankee aggression.
Listen, I'll let that man read any audiobook he wants to. Well, not anymore, he's dead. But
yeah, how about the Turner Diaries?
I think he would do a great job.
I'm also reading a book called Gift of the Devil, A History of Guatemala by Jim Handy. I had gotten another book by him a while ago called Revolution in the Countryside, Rural Conflict and Agrarian Reform in Guatemala 1944 to 1954. That's a fairly specific
that is a very specific book.
Of an interesting part of Guatemala's history, but I kind of wanted a bigger picture, wider shot of Guatemala before jumping into that, and I saw that he has this book as well, so I'm getting into that. That's been interesting so far. Guatemala is a place that I know a little bit about it in the 20th century, and a little bit about it in like the 1500s, and basically nothing in between. Aside from that little bit we talked about, like with Francisco Morazan and the Central American Republic, very little to fill in those gaps. So I'm excited to get further into this book.
Nice.
All right, then. Let's get into the order of the day. This episode is going to bring us to a body of water that is fairly significant in American history, particularly early American history, but I don't think we've really visited up to this point, and that is New York State's Hudson River.
I suppose we were close with the General Slocum, but we were on the other side of Manhattan.
This episode was largely inspired by a find from when Katie and I visited Thimbleberry Books in Marshfield, Wisconsin.
Okay.
If you're ever in central Wisconsin, check out Marshfield, check out Thimbleberry.
I don't think I've ever been to Marshfield.
There's really no reason to have gone there, I would think, for you.
I mean, driving up to... It's not like on the way to Superior.
It's not on the way, yeah. It wouldn't be on the way. It would be too far
It's not
east.
up by like Hayward and all that, right?
No, it's not that far.
Those are the little towns I know.
It's like basically in the middle of the state.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not super familiar there.
Across the street from Thimbleberry, there's a Cajun Italian fusion restaurant. It's called Mojo's Pasta House and Cajun Cook Shack. I recommend the Bayou-style Mojo mac and cheese.
That sounds excellent. Why is that in Marshfield, Wisconsin?
I don't know. I think I would like to know like the history of how that came to be. If that's the only one, if there's like a chain of them in north central Wisconsin, I don't know.
That definitely has more like Brookfield, Wisconsin energy.
Yeah, this is very good. But more of interest to us, something else I found in Thimbleberry's robust maritime section. It's a book by J. Thomas Allison titled Hudson River Steamboat Catastrophes, Contests and Collisions.
Not supposed to be having contests with your steamboats.
No, we'll talk about that. One man's race is another man's time trial. So I think the only time the Hudson has really even come up offhandedly in the episode on the Phoenix that we did, as we discussed the importance of the Erie Canal for the influx of immigrants to the upper Midwest. That was episode 113. We talked about the Phoenix. And to use the Erie Canal, passengers could take a trip up the Hudson from New York City to Albany and then take the canal westward to Buffalo and then out into the lakes. Of course, New York being a drop-off point for people coming from Europe. That's how we got so many Dutch people along the shores of Lake Michigan.
And so many Swedes and Norwegians and stuff in Wisconsin.
And Norwegians. A lot of the Germans, too. Since this is a new location and therefore kind of a new context for an episode, I want to read part of the introduction to Allison's book.
On August 17th, 1807, portrait painter turned engineer and inventor Robert Fulton began the first scheduled steamboat service between New York and Albany. It took 32 hours to cover the 150 miles, with one overnight stop. The belching smoke, sparks, noise, and splashing paddles of the early boats were compared to the devil sailing a gristmill up the river.
Travel was only possible between late March and early December, when the river was ice-free and open to navigation. The public loved skimming along at the breathtaking speed of 10 miles an hour, while the big wooden wheels churned the Hudson. In the late 1820s, 150 people at a time spent 18 hours on a steamboat, rather than 4 days in a stagecoach or on a sloop.
By mid-century, nearly 1,000 at a time were making the trip in less than 8 hours. In the height of summer, aboard one of 4 steamers, another 500 to 800 could experience a night in the luxury reserved for the rich on land. On the river, it was all theirs for the price of a ticket. There was always articles about the steamers when they first came on the river. When they had an accident, they made headline news again.
Life aboard was not so quiet after all. Sometimes boilers exploded, snuffing out a dozen or more lives in a second. Occasionally one caught fire, and passengers were given their choice of death, to be burned on board or to be drowned in the river. A clear, moonless night seemed to be the best time for passenger boats to collide, with one of the many sloops and schooners sharing the waterway. Aroused from sleep, 100 or more might struggle to find their ways to safety in the dark as the boat sank.
A few steamboats were fondly remembered for unique features or lavish appointments, long after they had been removed from the river. Others summoned up recollections of the frightful catastrophes that consumed them in the end.
So a lot of this summarizes what we've discussed before with other steamboat stories.
I was going to say, this is all pretty familiar territory. We know how frightening these explosions and things can be. It's like we talk about, there's just so many ways to die with these. You can, as it says here, you can burn or drown, but you could also be impaled and crushed. And sometimes it's a little of column A and a little of column B. How
terrifying and how frequent these were. As we've talked about, it reaches a point where this is an epidemic. You have newspaper columnists writing saying, steamboats should be banned, basically, because these cannot be operated safely. They're unsafe at any speed, I guess you could say, to borrow a phrase from someone else. Most in depth, we've gone into that topic in the Moselle episode, which was episode 93, and more recently, the Scioto episode in episode 140, both of which happened on the Ohio River. So definitely going back and listening to if you haven't, or if you just want to refresh. I personally am partial to the Moselle episode. I think it's some of our finest work.
I do enjoy that episode.
Today's episode will focus on a steamboat called the Empire. A lot of times it is cited as the Empire of Troy. In most of the contemporary writing, the newspaper articles, things like that, it's just called the Empire, and the of Troy just being there to differentiate it from other boats called the Empire. So I'll probably just be calling it the Empire, but the episode will be labeled Empire of Troy, because I think that's a cool name.
Absolutely.
Named for her hometown of Troy, New York, which is one of several important towns that grew up along the Hudson, serving first as a key transportation hub, and then later as one of the great industrial centers of this region.
Yeah, it looks like it. I mean, today you would probably call it a suburb of Albany, it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. One of those towns that, as things are industrializing, you sort of have a sort of a race between all these towns. Who is going to become the prime center of these things? In the process of researching this episode, I read a good bit about early transportation on the Hudson and on the Mohawk rivers in the decades after the American War of Independence, and then also on the Erie Canal, starting from 1825. It's an interesting time and place to read about. You've got all these towns along the Hudson jockeying for position as these transit points for freight and for passengers.
Mm-hmm.
That flow of immigrants who are trying to go west. And this happens by road, by water, and by rail a little bit, later on.
It's interesting that actually that John Brown book that I'm reading, he spends some time around Akron, kind of doing some speculating and stuff around canals. And Brown ends up kind of getting cut out when they decide to route a canal a different way than he was trying to get it done, and loses all his money in an investment. So this is a very speculative thing that's going on. This is like the Silicon Valley of its day.
Now, the John Brown I know would have cut the other guys out in a different way. So an interesting read from this research process was an article called Albany and Troy, Commercial Rivals by David Maldwyn Ellis from the journal New York History. And this is from October 1943.
I will say that I always like these kind of things when there's two towns like this and ultimately one becomes the bigger one with time. But back when these things are first getting established, it's not necessarily given that Albany becomes the bigger hub of
in
trade.
This case, Albany does have a bit of a head start because it's already an established town. I mean, at times in this that we're going to talk about here, there's every reason to think that Troy will sort of surpass Albany here.
It's sort of like how Chicago never quite has the port that Milwaukee and other places have. It's just not something that happens there. It happens in Indiana.
I mean, there's lots of what other good city rivalries do we have? I mean, obviously, New York and Boston would be an example, but they're pretty far apart.
San Francisco and Oakland. That's probably one where they're very different trajectories. I would say probably even the boroughs of New York before they become New York. Actually,
I guess within cities, different districts. But yeah, a little bit more about the Albany and Troy rivalry. On May 9th, 1845. The Wall Street Reporter commented that, quote, "The feuds of Montague and Capulet, or the wars of the White and Red Roses, have been mere child's play to the fierce hostility of the two cities."
Whether it is a question of the proper terminal point of the Erie Canal, the establishment of a steamboat line, the control of railroad traffic from the seaboard to the interior, or most crucial of all, the construction of a bridge at Albany, the merchants of Troy and Albany were quick to assert their claims and equally quick to prevent their opponents from winning any advantage.
So today, as you indicated, Troy is included in the Albany metropolitan area, for statistical purposes. But in the early 1800s, the two developed this really fierce rivalry for supremacy in this mid-Hudson area as it meets the Mohawk. A bit of geography here for some of these nuances. Both Albany and Troy are located up the Hudson River from New York. Albany is about 145 miles upriver, and Troy about another 5.
Have you been to that area before?
No, I've only ever been to Manhattan, I think is the only time I've ever been to New York.
I've been up into the Adirondacks, and then while I was up there, I took a trip down to Cooperstown, which I think is probably 2 hours east or 2 hours west of Albany.
Did you go to the Hall of Fame?
I did. It was, a couple things were wrong, or not fun. The biggest one being it was a youth baseball weekend, and it was just packed with little leaguers to the point where you couldn't walk without stepping on children. So that definitely brought it down.
Little leaguers that don't appreciate the game the way it's supposed to be played.
Exactly. Those little bastards don't appreciate what a real baseball player is.
So a big geographical wrinkle here, though, is that Albany is located on the west bank of the Hudson and Troy on the east bank. This is going to have implications for both the Erie Canal from the west and the expansion of rail networks from the east. The Mohawk and Hudson were, of course, important travel corridors before the existence of the Erie Canal. If you look at a topographical map of New York State, you've got the Hudson. You kind of see these two green lines where you've got the Hudson running up from New York and then the Mohawk meeting it sort of horizontally, cutting between, the Adirondacks and the Catskills?
Yeah, I think so.
And so where these meet, this is essentially where the Erie Canal is going to run. Before that, those rivers were important travel corridors. With Troy closer to the mouth of the Mohawk, on a map, it might seem like the better transit point between the two, but the falls at Cohoes prevented this from being a viable option. Instead, traffic coming down the Mohawk would stop at Schenectady and then be transported overland to Albany on the west, the easier side of the river to get to, and then back onto the river down to New York City.
So they would take it from Schenectady to
Albany. Basically portaging around those falls.
Quite the drayage operation there.
This road network develops here between those two towns.
I do think it's worth mentioning here, like, how uncontrolled these rivers are. Like, they're not the same as they are today, where they're far easier to navigate and, controlled. Like, the falls are a big deal.
But that would change, of course, in 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal.
Before the Erie Canal was built, Albany had no difficulty in retaining her virtual monopoly of the western trade. The canal, however, diverted the flow of freight to the artificial waterway, following the course of the Mohawk. As a result, Troy merchants were able to challenge their rivals on equal terms.
So now that this is putting people out in the river much closer to Troy, Albany's not siphoning off all that trade through Albany.
Mm-hmm.
Now a lot more of it is going to go through Troy. There's a kind of funny part near the beginning of this article where he's talking about a superficial aspect of the rivalry, wherein Albany had this reputation as a Dutch town because it was older, more established. A lot of the Dutch gentry, that's where they were from. Like the Schuyler family of Hamilton fame, and then Troy as more of a Yankee town.
America.
So there's a quote here. He says, "It must be noted, however, that the invasion of New Englanders penetrated Albany's economic life at an early date, and shortly after 1800, forced the old Dutch families to share political office. It is admittedly dangerous to ascribe definite characteristics to racial groups. Certain it is, however, that the Dutch and the Yankees have shown unusual talents in the marts of commerce." The 40s, a good time to be talking about, hey, let's not separate people by races. But it's funny that he's talking about white people and other white people.
Right.
He's talking about English Americans and Dutch Americans.
I mean, to be fair, aren't Italians still iffy at this point?
Dutch discrimination ended when Martin Van Buren became president, I think. So
much like the Italians, you're not one of us.
We need an Italian president. Have we ever had an Italian president?
Surely some. Well, probably.
Well, we've
not.
only had 2 Catholic ones, and they're both Irish. So no, I don't think we have. So the town of Troy. Speaking of Italians, it's a Aeneid reference, I guess. The town of Troy was founded in 1787. Oh, before we go any further here, I guess I never put this together. I knew of all these towns individually. I never put it together as a theme. Upstate New York is just full of towns that are named for classical locations.
Rome, Utica,
Ithaca, Syracuse, Albany, Troy. They're everywhere.
I will say that Utica, New York, is one of the most depressing cities I've ever driven through. It was awful. It was awful. I'm sure it's actually a nice place. It just didn't look great the day I drove through there. It was a lot of concrete and a lot of gray.
Avon, I wonder if that's a Shakespeare reference. Albion. I'm just looking at a map here now.
Someone had fun naming these places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I see New Berlin, which is where the people that started New Berlin, Wisconsin came from.
I wonder if they pronounce it like New Berlin does.
I don't know. I still struggle when I see it to say it the correct way.
All right. Medusa. There's a Medusa, New York. Okay. The town of Troy was founded in 1787 and quickly took hold.
Hold on one second. I found a Cicero.
I wonder if they pronounce it Kikero.
And a Homer.
There's a Cairo.
Cairo. It's probably Cairo there.
Kinderhook. That's where Van Buren was from, I think. The Van Buren boys.
It's the Van Buren boys.
I'll drop the Seinfeld clip in there. The town of Troy was founded in 1787 and quickly took hold of trade further up the Hudson and western Vermont. So, kind of as Albany. As Albany is sort of the release point west, Troy sort of takes that same thing and looking northward, so into Vermont.
I mean, interesting, too, that like 5 miles matters in that regard.
Well, also when you think about like the travel times here, some of the technology, it's like 5 miles is still going to take some time. You know, it's not like thinking of 5 miles by car today.
It's probably at least a day for you, and that's assuming the weather cooperates, right?
And you don't run into anybody, which, as we're going to see, is probably going to happen. Starting in 1787, and then within 2 decades, it has a population of around 3,000, which is not super impressive today, but for the time, it's pretty good. It was the opening of the canal that really launched this rivalry between Troy and Albany, since Troy now became a viable stopping point for river traffic. And so the way it works, I didn't have a great time-accurate single map of the canal. My understanding of it is that when the canal's put in, they basically, in order to keep both towns happy, although the main canal does empty near Troy, there is a sort of like cut added to Albany so that you could access both by water.
It's like when you see like the business route on like a rural highway, takes you through the town.
So throughout these years of competition, there were issues where the two towns were able to find common ground, or I guess common water in this case.
On one issue, the two cities saw eye to eye. Each wanted the state of New York, and later the federal government, to appropriate funds to improve navigation on the Hudson. Funds to cut through the overslaugh below Albany were matched by funds to deepen the channel between Albany and Troy.
If either expected to get aid, it found it wise to cooperate with its sister city. Albany, Troy, and 2 smaller towns of Waterford and Lansingburg pooled their resources to build a steam dredging machine.
Opportunities for disagreement on river improvements were not entirely lacking. The mayor of Troy charged in 1845 that Albany had tried to prevent the federal government from improving the river channel above Albany after the Erie Canal had been extended to the capital.
I guess that's a note for our international listeners. Albany was and still is the capital of New York State rather than New York City. That's one thing that's always weird to my international students, like my Chinese students, that in several states, the city that's much, 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 much bigger is not the capital. Like Illinois, they're surprised that Chicago is not the capital.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of that where like there's almost like a city state that is like New York or Chicago, and then there's the rest of the state.
Kind of the real, actual state.
Yeah.
So this is, again, one of the sources of this growing heated rivalry is once these improvements start to happen, then these arguments develop. Oh, well, this improvement to the river is helping this town more than our town, and we want something done about this.
Yeah, it's like a bunch of little kids complaining about who got a bigger slice of pizza.
The canal itself was another issue that brought Albany and Troy together starting in the 1790s, with leading citizens from both towns pushing for its construction, as well as that of the Champlain Canal, which, as the name might suggest, connects the Hudson River to Lake Champlain up in more northern New York, connecting. It almost connects into Canada, I think.
I think it's close. I don't think it does. It go?
I don't think it goes into Canada, but that's our lake.
It's going to be our lake.
If it isn't already.
Yeah.
It does extend into Quebec, so we're going to have to do something about that.
If we let them just keep speaking French, they'd probably just join, like, anyway.
I do think it's funny when, like, you'll occasionally see like a Quebecois, like, nationalist talking
Yeah.
about like being oppressed, and it's like, okay, this is at very like you're only like one layer in the sandwich, though. The Quebecois did not spring fully formed out of the ground in Canada, you see.
I feel like Quebec has too much Texas energy, and we don't need another Texas.
So it was sort of a joint project, this Champlain Canal with the Erie Canal. The Champlain Canal started work on that in 1817, and it fully opened in 1823. again, with the Erie opening in 1825. But for a lot of these canals, they open in segments. So it's not like they finish the whole thing and then, cut a ribbon and you can suddenly use it. The article also includes a lot of info on growing turnpike and rail networks in the region. Honestly, I could have just made the whole episode from this article. It was fascinating, but it's not really all about boats. There's a lot more cool stuff about the Erie Canal, particularly with this Troy and Albany rivalry, that I'm going to hold off on for now and pull back out when we talk in more depth. I'm thinking a series about the Erie Canal. Maybe like a 2-parter. I don't know. We'll see. For now, we're just going to grab one funny anecdote here, quoting here from Ellis.
Illustrative of the peevish attitude which the citizens of the neighboring city so often displayed was Troy's boycott of the official celebration which was held in Albany in 1823. It was with a certain malicious joy that Troy merchants secretly loaded and dispatched the Trojan trader as the first boat to pass westward on the canal, while their rivals were listening to speeches by high dignitaries of the state.
They snuck their boat into the canal while Albany was celebrating.
And just another example of just do it. Don't even ask. Just do the thing.
Even with Troy now having access to river traffic, it was largely only freight that was taking advantage of it. The passenger trade, again, like these people coming up from New York, it still makes more sense for them to go through Albany and then, head west. It already has this dominance of this westward transportation route, and most passengers are disembarking at Albany, traveling by stagecoach overland to Schenectady, and then continuing westward by canal boat or by stagecoach.
I imagine Albany just has more infrastructure in place.
A lot of these people, these are, multimodal trips they're on. They're probably not traveling the whole way the same sort of conveyance. By the 1830s, there's a rail connection from Albany to Schenectady on the Mohawk and Hudson line. And in addition to the added competition from railroads to the west, a road from Schenectady northward to Saratoga Springs also threatened Troy's dominance in the northern transportation networks. So it's always ebbs and flows. Like one will sort of gain the upper hand, and then something will happen that sort of levels it and then puts the other one ahead in this race.
It's almost like there was actual competition and innovation going on. That's weird.
Yeah, an enterprising young nation here.
Just filling in all that empty space that they found.
All of the pristine wilderness with no one living in it. But in the mid-1830s, Troy punched back. Quoting here from Ellis.
In 1835, the Rensselaer and Saratoga Railroad reached Ballston. Is that Ballston?
Ballston Spa.
In 1835, the Rensselaer and Saratoga Railroad reached Ballston Spa, where it met the Schenectady and Saratoga. The management of the latter road refused to cooperate. It refused to accept through freight or through passengers.
The Troy promoters complained bitterly of discrimination. Suddenly their opportunity came. A New York broker who held a controlling interest in the Schenectady and Saratoga agreed to sell his holdings to Richard Hart and other Troy capitalists.
Almost said Albanians.
That's what it says.
It does, doesn't it?
It does say Albanians, doesn't it?
Is that really what they're called?
Yes. It is.
I don't like it. Albanians woke up to discover that Troy, and not Albany, could and did dictate railroad service to the Springs. This coup, in addition to their previous activities, caused Philip Hone to comment that the Trojans are the most enterprising, persevering, go-ahead set of fellows in the world.
If Enver Hoxha had been here, he would not have tolerated this. But we're not here for railroads. We are here for steamboats. One steamboat in particular, the Empire. And from this point forward, any quotes that are otherwise unattributed are from the Allison book, Hudson River Steamboats. There's a few other sources we'll be using, though. I think they're all from newspapers. So, Empire was built in 1843, and she boasted some of the newest steamboat technology available. Allison writes in Hudson River Steamboats.
It was the first to be powered by a pair of William Lightall's patented horizontal engines and coal-fired boilers, introduced in 1840 in the Albany boat North America. No longer was a great pile of slab wood filling the foredeck. There was no walking beam rocking back and forth. Instead, the engine extended forward of the boilers. This style had been used successfully in steamboats on the western rivers, which had one paddle wheel in the rear and was found reliable.
An advantage of this new design is that Empire's 2 paddle wheels were powered independently. She had separate boilers for each of them, allowing a lot more maneuverability, especially useful for river travel, where you have some tighter quarters you have to navigate in. Also, they mentioned the walking beam there, and that's something you see in mostly older steamboats, where you have this kind of vertical column that's driving the wheels. It was a way, I believe the advantage of it was that you could essentially do more work with less fuel to the boiler, into the engine. So you didn't have to overwork the engine, and you could get more out of the engine.
Just running more efficiently, basically.
Empire is also larger than her predecessors on the Hudson. The first steamboat built on the Hudson longer than 300 feet, which, I mean, is small compared to a lot of the ships we would be discussing, but 300 feet for a steamboat that's traveling on the Hudson is pretty sizable.
Yeah, that's a vessel.
In addition to her size and speed, traveling on board the Empire was a luxurious experience.
Empire of Troy's maiden voyage was a contest for beauty, popularity, and speed. Every possible amenity one could want while traveling was offered. There were 70 plush staterooms to be booked by any of the 1,000 passengers aboard. Without boilers on the guards and a walking beam engine in the middle, the unobstructed deck became a grand saloon and promenade.
So talked about the walking beam, just this style of engine. There's also mention of the guards here. It says without boilers on the guards. The guards are talking about this kind of extension of the deck that some of these steamboats would have, used kind of to protect the paddle wheels, and then also it kind of allows you to spread things out, some of the machinery as well, so that if something does go wrong, it's not quite as devastating of an explosion in the middle of your boat. So Empire's maiden voyage took place on May 17th, 1843. And the only real memorable aspect of it that Allison notes is how Empire was overshadowed on this first voyage by the Albany boat, Curtis Peck.
Those bastards.
Which moved its departure time to match that of Empire. So clearly a challenge to a, quote, time trial.
This is like literally pulling up to the stoplight and revving your engine.
Yes, quite honestly, that's what's going on here. And you see that you kind of have these sort of like back and forth, just little sort of low boil aggression going on here.
Microaggressions, if you will.
And so that's where you see this term time trial kind of used tongue-in-cheek by a lot of these newspapers, because racing, of course, there's rules against that. You're not supposed to be racing. But, I mean, if we're both doing a time trial from point A to point B, and we happen to be doing it at the same time, that's not really a race.
We're not racing. We're just seeing who can get there first.
We're racing ourselves. The standard is the standard, competing against ourselves, really.
The standard is 10 wins.
According to Allison, Empire had more accidents in a single decade on the river than other boats could expect to have in 40 years.
Well, that's not good.
These accidents are common, so this is happening a lot to the Empire.
Yeah, I mean, if you're operating a vessel on a river, you're going to bump into stuff.
So this, of course, means that many of these are relatively minor, but still plenty for us to talk about here.
The first collision was with the 19th Street Landing on the North River. Coming in too fast under heavy morning fog, the pilot misjudged the dock and took out over 30 feet of heavily ballasted cribwork. Had it been a stone pier, the boat would have suffered major damage. But this time, it sustained only scarred wood, nothing broken.
So for any of our pedantic listeners, I believe, technically, that is an allision rather than a collision, because they're hitting a stationary object. But Empire's first ship-to-ship collision was with the lumber schooner Noah Brown, presumably named for the former Ohio State standout wide receiver. Actually, one of the 2 times that these same 2 vessels would collide. So not only are accidents frequent, you're sailing around a lot of the same vessels, so probably going to hit the same ship multiple times.
That's true.
We'll get to specifics of one of these collisions in a bit. The chronology in the book chapter is sometimes a bit confusing, so I sort of jumped out and relied on newspaper documentation for the accidents that we're going to talk about in detail. The earliest newspaper mention of the Empire that I could find is from the Boston Atlas on June 7th, 1845. So this is just over 2 years after the boat's construction.
The express steamer from Albany on Wednesday ran afoul of the Empire of Troy and carried away her rudder. The Empire, of course, was disabled, but the Knickerbocker, being astern, came alongside and towed her down to the city, where they both arrived about 8 o'clock a.m. yesterday. We learned from passengers on board both boats that before dark, when near New Baltimore, where the channel is narrow, the Empire was compelled to stop her engines until a large tow in the channel passed down.
When lying almost motionless, the Express came down without apparently checking her speed and dashed headlong upon the stern of the Empire. The bows of the Express are low, and they passed under the stern of the Empire, carrying away the rudder and all her fastenings, and sweeping everything from the forward part of the deck of the Empress.
So far as the opinions of passengers on board of both boats testify, it was altogether a cool, intentional outrage, and might have been avoided had any effort been made by the pilot of the Express to avoid the collision, as the boats were some distance apart when the Empire stopped her engines. The Empire has been taken to the dry dock, as all of the irons are wrenched from her stern, but otherwise she is not materially injured. She will resume her trips on Saturday afternoon.
A detail from that story that we'll see kind of in the one we go into in detail is accidents are pretty frequent here on the Hudson with this is a fairly busy stretch of water. And sort of the I guess the silver lining to that cloud is that there's almost always other vessels on hand to help out, to give you a tow, to pick people out of the water.
Sort of like the ferry in the San Francisco Bay.
Yeah, or like the Baltimore one that we did. There's at least people around to see that this has happened. So yeah, you see that a lot where when these collisions happen, there's almost always a boat following pretty close behind that can just sort of stop and help out. Several years later, this is May 12th, 1848, the New York Herald wrote about not just the Empire, but the quality of the Hudson River steamboats overall, and the appeal they had for those coming to America from abroad.
Travelers from Europe who visit this country are very willing to acknowledge the superiority of our noble river steamers. Among the most elegant of these steamers are the Empire of Troy, the Troy, the Isaac Newton, the Rochester, the Rip Van Winkle, the Oregon, the South America, etc. All of these steam palaces are commanded by gentlemen. They afford accommodations to the traveler which are quite equal to those of the best hotels in America.
So yeah, a note there. I mean, at this point, Empire's 5 years old, and she's still being listed first in this list from the New York Herald of these luxurious river steamers. Also, we'll see the Rip Van Winkle again.
That's a fun one.
Getting into the part that I have labeled the incidents, this is a boat that has multiple incidents throughout her career. One is sort of far more serious and headline grabbing than the others, and that's the one that we will focus on the most. So on May 18th, 1849, the Cleveland Daily Herald reported one of Empire's collisions with the Noah Brown. At the time of this accident, Empire was captained by William W. Tupper.
His family would actually go on to make a line of plastic containers to put...
A line of wares.
Yeah, a line of wares, if you will. Steamboat accident on the Hudson. A number of lives lost. Newburgh, New York, May 18th, 10 a.m. Steamer Empire of Troy was run into by the Noah Brown of Troy last night at 10 o'clock and sunk to the promenade deck before assistance could be had. Fortunately, the steamer Rip Van Winkle, upward bound, came to her assistance and rescued the lives of 300 passengers. It is impossible to give an accurate number of lives lost. A small boat first came ashore with the bodies of 6 ladies taken from the wreck. 11 bodies found up to 8 o'clock this morning. They have just pumped water from the boilers and found the body of another lady.
Zach Bagans would love this because there's definitely some lady ghosts going to be
some
around
lady
here.
Ghosts. This furthers our theory that it's better to be a man in a shipwreck.
Yes.
Under the age of like 40.
Plenty of evidence to suggest that.
You really want to shoot for that like 18 to 40 range.
Up to a certain point in history. Now with survival technology, it has evened the playing field.
Now that survival's gone woke.
Allison includes a letter written to, I think, the New York Daily Tribune. I mixed up some of my labels with my newspaper PDFs. I think this is from the New York Daily Tribune. From a Mr. Fellows, who served as steward on board the Rip Van Winkle.
Coming up last evening with the steamer Empire, we were about half a mile astern of her, when suddenly she stopped and commenced blowing off steam. We passed her thinking nothing serious had happened, till her bell began to ring for assistance. When we saw that she was sinking fast, Captain Schuyler ordered his pilot to round the boat as soon as possible.
We reached the wreck just as the water put out the fires in her boilers. It was quite dark at the time. It's in all caps. I don't know why that one part is in all caps. And the Empire was in the middle of the river, a little below Newburgh, where it's about 2 3/4 of a mile wide. We found that she'd been run afoul by the schooner Noah Brown, which had struck her hull. She sank to her stateroom deck in about 3 minutes. The scene was terrible and heartrending. As we came alongside of the wreck, there was a great rush to get on board our boat.
Some jumped in the river hoping to reach us, but perished. We rescued about 200 of her passengers and crew, and cut holes in her deck as a means of escape for anyone trapped below. We drew one woman out from the top of the ladies' saloon, who was nearly gone. She was the last taken from the wreck. We next towed her ashore on the Fishkill Flats. Many lives must have been lost, for a great number had jumped off and been carried away by the tide before we could reach them. At Newburgh, we left those who had friends missing. All agree that the conduct of Captain Schuyler of the RVW was generous and manly, and that all that could have been done, he did, and did well.
Initial reports indicated that 20 passengers from the Empire were drowned or missing, although most casualty estimates from any accident from this time is going to be an approximation. In this case, at least 228 passengers were saved from the wreck.
Mm-hmm.
Estimates of how many were on board you see from 200 to 300. And later on, the most exact number that I saw was 23 killed.
Uh-huh.
Again, there's no reason necessarily to think that is 100% accurate.
But like any number between 20 and 50 could probably be plausible.
20 to 30 is kind of the estimate that they land on. Also, to address, maybe the rapping elephant in the room, Schuyler here, maybe we're familiar with Hamilton. Hamilton marrying into the Schuyler family. His father-in-law is General Philip Schuyler from this similar area of the country. So these two families are possibly tangentially related.
Mm-hmm.
These Schuylers, and this is a family that runs a successful tow boat business on the Hudson. These are referred to as the Black Schuylers.
Oh.
Because the founding member of this family was a freedman who worked on the river, eventually was able to buy his own boat, and then expanded that into a much bigger business. The Captain Schuyler here, I believe it's his son who takes over the business after him. So Rip Van Winkle is just one of the boats that they have operating on the rivers. I believe this Schuyler's brother is also a captain on the river. And this company lasts through like the 1800s, if not further. And that interested, because that's a kind of unique business story, in early America.
I don't imagine there's a lot of black ship captains like in this time.
And even that, it's like that there are a lot of, black sailors. There's some black captains, but here we have, what is essentially a black business magnate. He's not like a huge, massive industrialist, like we're talking like a Carnegie or someone, but someone who's operating this business, and it's, it's sort of forming this river dynasty. So I did want to look more into that. I found a lot of really interesting stuff that I don't just want to shove into this episode because they're not really the central characters here. But I think they'd be a great bonus episode to look at as a way to sort of explore that avenue that I certainly don't know a lot about.
I didn't even know that it was like even a thing I could learn about. I didn't know it existed. That is very interesting.
Getting down a bit more into this, kind of the details of this accident. Throughout the steamboat age, most accidents can be classified as either boiler explosions or collisions, and sort of the things that come off of them. Boiler explosion, of course, can lead to a fire, and maybe that's what ends up actually killing people. Boiler explosions could often be chalked up to the boilers being either overworked or under-maintained, or usually both. Like we talked about in the Moselle episode, they had to pass laws to force these engineers to just change the goddamn water in your boilers.
And don't use that muddy river water either.
Right, because this stuff, if you kept the same water in there, it would build up, it'd build up these deposits in the boilers, and that's what would clog these pipes. And so actually, when some of these steamboats explode, you have some very early sort of forensic analysis, just like watching an episode of Air Disasters where the guys are walking around the crash site looking at little pieces. You'd have that where they would look at some of the, the piping that connected these. They'd look at these pipes and they're just totally jammed, with silt. And they're like, well, there's your problem, quite literally.
Just to bring this back to something we were talking about earlier, we were talking about like media that gets released like right before like a major world event. This connects back to poorly maintained boilers with the Sultana, which kind of gets forgotten because it's right. What is it? Right before? Or no, it's right after Lincoln is assassanated. It's in like that.
Yeah, because there's the guy with he's trying to sell all the newspapers with the Lincoln.
So it's just very interesting that like that, that's a great example of poorly maintained boilers, but it does get overshadowed by Lincoln.
Or again, we've talked at length about these things being overworked and all of the tricks that engineers would use to try and get more out of these boilers, which would often make them explode. A lot of these explosions were not that all these boilers were poorly constructed. It was that they were way too easy to tamper with. A wrench in the right place, a chain in the right place could get you what you wanted for a little bit. Collisions were often blamed on racing or drunkenness, and there were some who blamed racing for the collision of the Noah Brown and the Empire. Not that Noah Brown and Empire were racing, but claiming that Empire had been engaging in a race with the Rip Van Winkle.
No wonder she was in position to help.
Right. Yeah, when you're racing, that would put you in position. This is like Michael Scott hitting Meredith with his car. Fortunately, I was on site to help out. Quoting here from Allison.
The fact was denied by Captain Tupper. He stated they did pass Rip at the beginning because the tide was giving them an advantage. No doubt, the speed with which Captain Schuyler overcame them was offered as proof of a contest.
On many occasions over his 66-year career, Captain Schuyler was called to testify as an expert witness on the local steamboat practices. He was a highly respected captain and citizen.
Like his brother, Captain Thomas Schuyler, with whom he began what was to be the largest team towboat company on the river, he was a member of the Temperance Union and a strict Methodist. If he turned his back on dancing, drinking, card-playing, and gambling, one would expect he turned his back on steamboat racing as well.
So yeah, I mean, assuming that if someone abstains from all these other vices, they wouldn't do anything else, which I think is kind of a dangerous way of thinking, because
maybe he had like a fight with his wife the night before and he's in a bad mood. You know what I mean? Like, who knows?
This guy's a priest. Surely he wouldn't hurt a child. The one does not indicate the other necessarily, but sure, he does not have a reputation for this. This is not something he would be known for. Plus, this is not some like freelance dude trying to, make a few bucks on the river. This is a respectable businessman. He's the face of his company. Like he's he's probably not engaging. It's probably beneath him just to be, racing people on the river with his company property. On company property. With company property.
Double jeopardy.
The inquest into the sinking began 2 days later on May 20th. One of the people deposed was the Empire's pilot, Levi Smith, who stated that he and the wheelsman were in the pilot house at the time of the collision, and that the Noah Brown was 800 to 1,600 feet away when first sighted, moving at a high speed. That's a pretty big range.
That
Estimate
is.
was
Twice as far, actually.
Multiple boat lengths. It's like 10 p.m. at night. Probably not easy to estimate. I know I would be bad at estimating distances.
Oh, absolutely.
Estimating that they wouldn't be able to swerve in time and assuming that a collision was about to happen, Smith ordered the Empire into reverse. So just hoping to reduce the severity of the impact.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like a don't veer for deer situation.
Yeah. True.
There's nothing I can do about this. C. Smith testified that he called for the Noah Brown to change course, adding that the schooner, quote, had time to luff and come about twice.
What does luff actually mean?
I believe to pull up to your sails that you a sailor listening to this could probably tell us correctly. Something about slowing down and changing course.
Okay.
The Noah Brown's captain denied hearing any call to change course. One widely circulated account of the sinking came from Henry Burden, a major figure in Troy's business and industrial circles. And also, I pulled up one of my tabs about Captain Samuel Schuyler, the guy who started that company. He's actually described as Albany's first African-American businessman. So
interesting.
Like a true pioneer of business in the region. Anyway, talking about another business person, this one from Troy, Henry Burden. Among other innovations, I just saw this on this Wikipedia, he invented a machine to make horseshoes. It could make 60 horseshoes per minute, which seems like really good for like the 1840s.
Yeah, no, that seems like a lot of horseshoes.
I guess I would have been surprised if you told me that a machine today could make 60 horseshoes in a minute. I don't know if they're good horseshoes.
We can't. We've lost that technology and we can't do it anymore.
We can't. We don't know how. Maybe like Temu has horseshoes that they make 60 per minute, but it seems really fast for making horseshoes.
Have you ever bought anything off Temu?
No, because I don't want to get a virus on my computer.
It seems so janky.
There's things I've seen that I want from Temu, but no, I resist that. You can now go visit the Burden Iron Works as a historical site in Troy. I was just telling Katie, like all these places, they sound so cool. I would just want to take a trip to like the Hudson and Mohawk Valley. I don't even want to go to New York City. I don't even care.
It is a really cool place. Like the parts I've seen of going down to like Cooperstown and all that. There's so much history and stuff that's gone on in those areas.
I've just always wanted to go to Utica, New York.
I mean, I'd go back. I'd give Utica another chance.
So because this is a widely circulated account, so presumably a lot of people would have heard about the accident from this account. I'm including most of the excerpt that's included in the Allison book, but this appeared in a lot of newspapers that were covering this story.
I was passing along the main deck, and being chilly, stood near the engine at the starboard side to warm myself. The engineer was in the engine room, and we were conversing when I heard the sound of the gong, the first strike of which means stop. In an instant, the double stroke, which means reverse, indicated to my ear the proximity of danger ahead. The engineer promptly obeyed the order, but 5 seconds did not elapse from the command to stop until I heard the crash on the starboard bow.
The steamer careened immediately to the side on which she was struck. Looking out, I saw the schooner with her stem right in the Empire. Soon after, I heard the cry that the latter was sinking. From the slow progress of her descent, I knew a considerable time must elapse before she could go down. I thought that all was right, and the captain or pilot would have given necessary orders as to what should be done, or give passengers intimation of their danger and advice as the emergency demanded.
But no such order was given, nor advice, nor warning of danger, nor did any officer of the Empire come upon the main deck or near the ladies' cabin where I waited in expectation of obtaining earliest information of our situation. I heard irresponsible persons who cried out frequently, "There's no danger, don't be alarmed," repeating those words when the water was over the starboard side of the main deck. There was not even a light available.
I endeavored to loosen the tackle of the yawl slung at the side, filled with passengers crying out in agony for someone to lower the boat. But I couldn't do so for want of a lantern. And it's worthy of remark that the boat continued fastened to the steamer till it was pulled down by her underwater, and passengers had to escape from it to the upper deck.
It was the circumstances of a large number of light boxes filled with dry goods being on deck, which floated up against the saloon deck, and in my estimation, kept her from entirely going down. Believing from all analogy and experience she would go to the bottom in very few seconds, I now, in the last extremity, waded through the water to get a hold of a box, and hastened with it to the after gangway on the starboard side, taking my position on the railing, holding on by the stanchion with one hand and the box with the other, where I stood till the Empire settled down from under my feet and left me floating in the river.
Burden estimated that he was in the water for about a half hour before he was picked up by a shad fishing boat along with 3 others from the Empire. And so this is May in New York State. So not quite as frigid as some of the places that we've been. Probably not warm.
Yeah,
I'm guessing.
I doubt it's great.
But clearly, survivable. A lot of these people are in the water for a good bit of time. It's also helped by the fact that the Empire does not sink entirely. There's more to Burden's letter, but as we can pick up from this excerpt, he has very little good to say about how the accident was handled by the crew of the Empire. He's one of these big industry magnates, so he has river boats also. So he, in theory, kind of knows how they should be operating. He's obviously traveled on them before also.
And at the very least, his opinion carries a lot of sway, I imagine.
People are going to read this and people are going to pay attention to what he says. He has a lot of influence. As detailed in his letter, he felt that no one took charge of the evacuation. The people that did do things were hurting, if anything. Telling people to calm down, there's no reason to panic when the ship is literally sinking. He's saying, the water's up above the starboard railing. Which, again, that's not a new thing. We've seen that before, where there's essentially just denial that this is a problem at all. He also felt that the Empire should have made for Newburgh, only about a quarter-mile distance, which should have been possible even with the Noah Brown lodged in her hull. She had these new fancy engines that had quite a lot of power and, in theory, could have gotten her to shore. However, that wouldn't have been possible because I believe it's mentioned in one of those quotes we read, is that command had been given to blow off all of her steam when that collision happened, which was a normal thing to do because since you're not moving, you don't want to risk this boiler explosion from it being overworked now that it has all this extra weight that it's trying to carry. So just venting out all of that steam that's built up just to avoid that risk. Another passenger, Nathaniel Payne, did fault the crew for failing to toll the alarm bell earlier. Payne was on the upper deck rather than the main deck with Burden. And this could have gotten the Rip Van Winkle on scene earlier. As it was, she had to stop, turn around, and make her way back downriver to where the Empire was.
Thought they were just faking at first to try to pass them up in the time trial.
Being asked to kick the ball out of bounds, and they're refusing to do so. Allison continues with more from pilot Levi Smith's testimony.
When asked at the inquest about any previous accidents in his career, Levi Smith stated he was a pilot when the Empire struck a sloop several years before, and again when she struck a pier in New York. Prior to coming aboard Empire, he was a pilot on the steamer Albany when it ran into a sloop. Early in his career, he was a pilot of Henry Burden's boat Helen when he had his rudder torn off while coming into the Troy dock.
Empire's captain was, of course, also asked for his account of the accident.
Captain Tupper gave an account of his routine that night. By 10 o'clock, he had retired to his cabin. Earlier in the evening, when they stopped for a boat, he did not go out when he heard the bell, as that is not unusual in the lower river. Sails always took the right of way, and letting them cross one's path was not just a courteous act, it was the law. In this instance, he remained in his cabin until he heard 3 bells and felt the concussion.
So that hints at some of the interesting interactions here at this time when steam vessels are increasingly common on the rivers, but you still have a lot of sailing vessels that are, of course, reliant on the wind and a lot less maneuverable. So they sort of have the right of way when there's these sort of head-to-head situations. In the immediate aftermath, it was reported that a large number of female passengers had been in the lower cabins, but Captain Tupper denied this, saying that it was his rule to keep them higher up on the vessel.
Interesting. I've never really heard that before.
Yeah, I don't know. That wasn't really expanded on. But yeah, he likes to store his ladies up top in the overhead compartment. There had been a passenger list with 3 pages of names coming to about 250, but the list itself had been lost. Tupper estimated that upbound trips carrying immigrants could have as many as 600 on board. We know these steamboats were often overloaded. Honestly, it's kind of quaint to only see it overloaded to twice its capacity. That's actually pretty good compared to like a Sultana.
Yeah, we've seen worse.
About 50 people actually walked to safety aboard the Noah Brown across a plank that had been thrown down between the 2 vessels.
That's always interesting in some of these when they're able to do that.
Someone grabbed the escape plank. Also, again, this is a highly trafficked part of the river. Even though it is fairly late, you do have, like we saw, you have fishermen who are out at the time. So there's a lot of small boats coming from Newburgh that are removing passengers from the wreck or picking them up out of the water. The May 19th, 1849 issue of the New York Herald read,
"As soon as the passengers were rescued from the wreck, the steamer was taken in tow by the Rip Van Winkle for some distance, after which she drifted about a mile upriver, where she still remains, her stern resting upon a bar. There was a heavy freight of furniture and merchandise on board, all of which is destroyed by water, or floated off up the river. The Empire will be towed to this city to be raised. The damage done to the boat and furniture is estimated at about $15,000, upon which there is no insurance."
So not a case of insurance fraud.
No.
Or if it was, they forgot an important part.
The important part.
The May 25th, 1849 issue of The Liberator carried an update from Newburgh, reading,
"The wreck of the Empire still lies near the east side, opposite this place. Her stern is sunk in about 20 feet of water. Rough weather, it is thought, would cause her irreparable injury. The John Mason is alongside to receive such baggage and other property as may be found. The wreck presents a distressing appearance."
The upper rigging contains many kinds of human apparel found floating on the boat, and which denotes that the extent of loss in life has not yet been ascertained. There are numerous rangers in pursuit of the remains of deceased friends.
The coroner's jury returned their verdict last evening. It censures the pilot of the Empire and attributes the collision to his negligent carelessness or want of judgment. No effort has been made to raise the Empire. The delay is exciting deep feelings. The total number of dead bodies found is 17.
At that point, that was about a week after the sinking. And
It has to be a pretty eerie sight with like the clothes and everything.
Yeah, it's sort of
the
dangling off of it. You got like furniture floating around, luggage probably.
And like, there's bodies around.
So all in all, like I said, casualty estimates are in the range of 20 to 30. I couldn't find anything about what came of this inquest, if there was any actual punishment for this. I guess I'd like to assume that the pilot lost his pilot license. Since,
one
again,
would think.
This was not his first time. This one doesn't seem to be the Empire's fault.
Right.
So yeah, this one I guess you can't totally blame on the Empire. And yeah, like it's interesting the speed at which this happens. As that one quote mentions, hearing the bell, throwing it into reverse as you would with an impending collision, and then 5 seconds later it happens. So it's like there's no realistic way of avoiding this.
Right.
So Empire resumed her service on the Hudson for several years until the final incident of her career and this episode on July 16th, 1853. This was another collision, but not with the Noah Brown.
Oh, that's good. At least changed up the victim here.
That had happened twice already. This was with the sloop General Livingston. And here's the account that I found in the Cleveland Daily Herald.
We are compelled to record another fatal steamboat accident upon the Hudson, by which a number of lives have been lost, and the community again shocked and appalled. This is the second calamity to the Empire of Troy within 5 years, which has resulted in the loss of life. On Saturday last, the same boat within 13 miles of the same spot met with a similar disaster.
The Empire left Troy at 7 o'clock Friday evening last, and about 2 o'clock the next morning came in collision with the sloop General Livingston, 6 miles below Poughkeepsie. The night was sufficiently clear to see a mile and a half. Both boats were under perfect command, and the pilots saw each other at a great distance. And yet, under full speed, they came in collision. That Cleveland Daily Herald article then quotes the New York Times reporting on the incident.
The sloop's bowsprit entered the steamboat immediately before the wheel, on the larboard side, breaking into the fire room. Immediately after the collision, the boiler exploded, tearing away the side and making a complete wreck of the steamboat amidships. The smoke pipes were blown over, the deck and the staterooms between the boilers torn away, as also the heavy frameworks known as the hog frame, and a frame of great thickness. Iron braces of 2 inches in diameter were twisted over and broken, and the other iron rods snapped like twigs. The boiler dropped into the river. The vessel careened over on the starboard side.
This being an ultimately less deadly but more violent collision here with this explosion. Sometimes we talked about the kind of the either or. Sometimes it was both. Sometimes a collision led to a boiler explosion. As many as 14 passengers were badly scalded in this explosion. 8 were reportedly killed by steam suffocation, which probably involves some scalding as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you don't have to be steam suffocated, but you have to be scalded, right?
1 scalded passenger was lost overboard and drowned. So 9 killed in total here. The New York Times, in their article, they list 7 names that are known of these victims. I assume one of those missing is the passenger that drowned.
Mm-hmm.
The names listed are Cornelius Van Schaik of Troy, a book peddler.
Man just wanted to sell his books.
It said a book peddler on board the Empire, so I don't know if he did that on the boat. It seems like a fairly lucrative thing to do if you have people traveling for long periods of time,
especially if they're like immigrating and like they know that they don't have like any form of entertainment like waiting for them. Like,
get your hands on like some Dutch books. Yeah, you kind of corner the market, and I think a guy named Cornelius Van Schaik could probably get his hands on some.
You can learn about Dutch Christmas.
One of the people at the time they were killed, they were actually dressed up as Zwarte Piet. So
whom's to say if it was good or bad?
John Shannon of Albany. The names on this one, the print was a bit hard to read. It was a bit sort of muddled. Betsy Govanis and Mary Badine. 2, I'm going to call them native women.
Mm-hmm.
The newspaper from 1853 uses different words for them. Christopher Caffrey of Eagle Bridge, New York. Edward C. Cushing, who's listed as second engineer, I assume that being second engineer on the Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And George Safford, a barkeeper.
Again, is that necessarily like
I don't know if that means on the boat or if that is just what his job was. So that ends up being the end of the Empire. The towboat Wyoming assisted the wreck to the shallows, where Empire would be declared a total loss. She's sailed for a decade, and it's been a rough decade. She's been in a lot of scrapes, probably due for a retirement here.
You know what they say, oceans rise, empires fall.
We have seen each other through it all.
There's a lot of Hamilton in this episode. To be fair, we're in like the right region.
So yeah, I mean, this was a fun one. I like Steamboat stories just because you get a lot of cool, quirky things because the technology is changing so fast, because the country is changing so fast at this time demographically. You have a lot of unique stories from the steamboat age.
I think there's a lot. I mean, you have interactions with native peoples. You've got interactions with immigrants that don't even know where they're going or what is Wisconsin? I don't know, but I'm going there. There's just so many layers and different things going on here.
Yeah, I mean, a complicating factor in that, and I think we talked about it in the Phoenix, is that there's sort of a leveling that takes place when you just see things as the number, say, 200 passengers on board. Maybe 80 of those passengers don't speak a word of English.
Mm-hmm.
They even if there are instructions of what to do, it's like they might not know what this person's trying to tell them, because like they're coming to this whole new world.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. It's one that we haven't really talked about something in this area, so that was it's very interesting.
So with that, I guess if that's all of our final thoughts, this is a fairly long one, which is fine. I'm good with longer ones with our new recording schedule. And hopefully going to get a bonus episode out about the Skylers of the Hudson Valley and their towboat company at some point here in the near future.
Nice. Yeah, that'll be cool to learn more about that.
Aside from that, our next recording will be a $3 bonus episode. I think we have a movie that we're going to watch, an old movie.
It's an old period piece from World War II.
Cool. So that'll be our next project we'll get to. We'll get that edited and out as soon as it's done. With that, thank you for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.